This is responding to pandemics. Why don't we start down here on my far right and have each of us introduce ourselves and why we're interested in this field and what our background is.
Hi, I'm Nick Rao. I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist. You don't tend to see a lot of pandemic mental illness, but here I am.
Awesome. I'm Sofiya Pasternack. I am a ICU nurse. I deal with trauma and sepsis, that kind of thing. If you have the flu really bad in Provo, I will be the one poking you with stuff, basically, in the hospital.
My name is Eric Swedin. I'm a professor of history at Weber State University. I have 11 published books, 5 of them novels. My doctorate's in the history of science and technology, and one of my fields was history of medicine. So I guess that's why I'm here. Questions are welcome from the audience, but why don't we start? We have some sample questions here, and why don't we start with, and we'll just go down the row, and we'll start with Nick. How did older societies respond to pandemics?
So it's actually pretty fascinating historically because there seems to have been a lot of lost knowledge in this area during the Middle Ages as well. So we often think of Louis Pasteur and all these people as the ones who came up with germ theory, but we know ancient Rome understood it, we know ancient India understood it, we know ancient Egypt understood it. So they built sanitation systems that would actually keep pandemics from being spread by human waste and by the simple overcrowding issues that we saw a lot of in the Middle Ages. This appears to have been something that worldwide everybody kind of forgot about, including Greece and India and Egypt, and of course Europe, which we think about when we think about the Black Plague. So the responses to pandemics historically have always been quarantine, and not just quarantining the infected individual, but the entire household. And we can certainly think about the myths in all cultures where they talk about that. But quarantine was their number one thing, and the number two thing was don't pick up water downstream of where you dump waste. This is something that societies forgot for like 500 or 600 years. It's amazing, you know. But those were their two things, you know.
Sophia? Quarantine for sure. There's, even in New York as recently as the 1800s, they had an island off of the Bronx where they stuck people that just had anything that they thought was icky. I think it started out with leprosy, tuberculosis. Eventually, if you had anything, they would just throw you on the island, and sometimes it was just vanishing. They didn't have shore-to-shore phones back then, so one day your sick family member would just disappear, and they were gone forever. Typhoid Mary died on this island. It was called North Brother, and that's where they stuck her for 30 years after she was non-compliant with not going to be a cook anymore. And that's fairly common all around the world. They would just take these diseases that were high mortality rates, and whoever had it or whoever they thought might have it, quarantine, stick them on an island, put them on a boat, get rid of them, get them away from everybody else, which I mean, it was effective, but not the best way to deal with these types of things. That lost knowledge, just sanitation, that kind of thing, that's kind of how it's gone today. And that's how we deal with it now, instead of just shoving people on an island somewhere and letting them go.
I'm going to agree that with older cultures, you had this common sense thing that these people were catching. I think that's a better way of putting it than say infectious, because they didn't have an intellectual theory about why disease was moving, but they knew that people that were sick they wanted to be away from, and so they would quarantine, and it was effective. And then as you developed Western medicine wanted a theory to justify why they were doing things, and Western medicine's theory of miasma, which is just that it's the culture, it's just the bad air that's causing this to happen, moved away from quarantines, and yes, that didn't work. A lot of Western medicine, quite frankly, didn't work, and it wasn't until they had an understanding of germ theory, which Louis Pasteur was heavily involved with in the 1860s, that now they actually had an intellectual idea to go back to that old wisdom of quarantines. And quarantines are they're harsh. There's no doubt. Even my great grandfather died of cholera back in like the 19 teens, and the reaction of the community was to remove the family and burn the house and all the bedding and everything that was physically associated with him. And we can say, oh, that was stupid. Well, was it? They didn't understand, that community did not understand where cholera came from. Anything that was associated with that person, they wanted destroyed. And of course, what it did is it impoverished my great-grandmother and her children, because everything was now gone. I think that oftentimes when we look at old stories of medicine, that we overlay our contemporary understanding from, as they like to call it now, experiment-based medicine or experience-based medicine, as opposed to, say, alternative medicine. Okay. Let's move on to another topic, which is how would a society respond to a pandemic today? And I'll just point out erratically. And why don't we start again with, yes?
Actually, with this, actually I'll wait until after you guys.
Okay.
Answer my question.
Yeah. So response to pandemics, we can get some idea of them, right? Most of us here actually were alive during the whole AIDS discovery, the AIDS crisis of the 80s. We may not have been very old during it, but most of us have some experiential knowledge of it. And also, of course, these days we talk about the flu, and all of us are sitting there, and every year they talk about, oh, what if it's swine flu again? What if it's the 1918 pandemic? How we respond to it is a lot of panic and a lot of things that sound like a good idea, but may or may not be. We're in a lot of ways, they call it practicing medicine for a reason. So right now, everybody's losing their mind over the flu, and it's the funniest thing to me. I work in ICUs as well. I work primarily with critically ill children, and so we're all like busy keeping our pediatric ICU as empty as possible, because any day we're going to be crushed under the weight of this, right? So all that's happened is our pediatric ICU has 2/3 of its bed free every day. The other thing that we see is a lot of sort of panic-based, this makes me feel better. So I now have to wear a mask whenever I go into any room for any patient, for no reason at all. But it makes someone in infection control happy. We're actually wasting, I waste just on the mask I'm putting on, I waste over $200 a day, just me, putting on these masks and taking them off. That $200 a day could probably be spent doing something to actually minimize the spread of the flu. But on the other hand, you see more sensible things, such as our hospital now has a policy where if it's the flu, it doesn't even count on your sick days. You will be sent home by your supervisor. It doesn't count towards your sick days. The other thing that happens is
That's a great policy.
and ordering doctors to leave is really important, because we are really bad at calling in sick. I've had days where 104-degree fever, and I'm working with a cancer kid with immunosuppression, and obviously I can't go into his room, so we're FaceTiming to do his medical exam that day. That's how bad we are. So finding ways to get people out who are actually really good infection vectors is another really important thing we do. This was something that we saw in the Ebola crisis. We lost a number of doctors because the doctors were not being very good at protecting themselves from infection. So that's actually one thing that I wonder about, is how often we as physicians are acting as infection vectors and pandemic vectors within a hospital, especially when there's a hospital-acquired infection crisis. But that's sort of what we see today, is just panic and put something on, like some sort of totem of this little surgical mask, this piece of paper that I then pretend magically protects me from the flu.
I keep seeing someone raising a hand over here.
Okay.
Yeah, flu keeps being brought up. As you said, it seems so odd because it's like such a wide spectrum. On one hand, every year it's always about the flu, and yet nothing ever seems to happen. But then you occasionally get the 1918 Spanish flu, or what was in the Planet of the Apes movie with the simian flu. Or why is it that the flu is so buried in its lethality?
The flu's got so many different strains that it does every year. It's kind of, it evolves very well, it adapts very well. So it adapts. We make our immunity to it, and then it goes, okay, well, this isn't working anymore. I'm going to look like this now. And so the flu changes so much, and there's so many different variations of the flu that it's a survivor. It has killed more people historically in human lifespan than anything else. So the flu will get you.
No. If we could be clarified, unfortunately, the word flu means something different in common parlance. So what we're talking about is influenza.
Influenza virus, yeah.
And when people say, I have the flu, what they're really saying is, I have this intestinal virus, which is a different type of thing. So when everyone's worried about the flu, they're actually kind of confused about what symptoms constitute the flu unless they've looked things up or have some medical training and such. Yes, yours.
I was going to point out that we actually still do quarantine. We just don't see it inside the U.S., but when working in an international airport, Anchorage International, we had very extensive quarantine measures, and there were people that they came in, customs saw and went, no, you're not entering the country. And we actually had to set up quarantine areas before we could ship people back to China and Singapore, because we just, when SARS was going through, we weren't letting them in. Of course, them being on maintenance, we had to go clean those with janitorial, and they were slapping us with every vaccine known to man, it seemed.
Right.
And then going, and we're going to quarantine you in your home if you show any flu symptoms.
And of course, the problem is they just were on a flight, which is like an incubation engine.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else.
Because the
And there
recirculated
were
air.
whole airplanes that got quarantined.
And they did quarantine entire airplanes, that they turned everybody around and sent them back. But they didn't make the news, so most people were like, oh, no, we're just worried about this in the U.S.
So I did actually want to pick up on that because you brought up a very important point. Some disorders or some diseases are more localized than others. And kind of like what we saw with Zika was spreading worldwide, or before that, a virus called chikungunya, which we saw kind of spread all over the world, which Americans still aren't super educated about. But we have things like TB too, which we kind of forget about TB now. But tuberculosis, which is, it's actually really scary now because we've got extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis. And like you pointed out, Dorothy, I know you. Like you pointed out, we need, in order to control like the entry of these things, we need to know when people are coming in sick. Extensively drug-resistant TB is happening in the U.S. because we don't know when people are coming in sick. And people are actually specifically coming in here when they're sick in order to find better treatment in the U.S. So I get exposed to XDR TB on a regular basis, and it's shocking and it's scary because it probably, less than you actually, you're the adult ICU doctor, you see it even more than me. But it's kind of shocking because it's happening and we don't even know it. Sorry.
Yes.
So, now, granted, this is a virtual plague that I'm about to bring up, but
Okay.
you've got the corrupted blood incident from World of Warcraft, where a buff or a debuff on high-level characters that was just minor inconvenience absolutely slaughtered full servers of low-level players because the buff was allowed to leave the raid.
This is something about 10 years ago, as I recall.
Yeah, and then you had people, like, full servers became ghost towns for a while until the buff was able to be removed.
It was an interesting.
And you had players there were people setting up quarantines. You could not leave for example,
The players were trying to use the in-game mechanics to survive.
Yeah, you had people from Alliance and Horde in Tarn Mill, and you were not allowed to leave there.
Now, what they needed was to pray to Blizzard to resurrect.
Pray the buff away. And then you had other people plotting how to infect areas like Stormwind or Orgrimmar, and like people still use it. How do you respond to someone that is actively trying to infect someone? They infect themselves and then they go into an airport. They don't even need to get on a plane. They just need to be in the same area. How do you respond to that kind of an attack?
In the U.S., we basically cover our eyes and pretend that this isn't happening every day 1,000 times a day. That's what we do here. And then we go, oh, where did this come from? And that's what we do here. But what we need is effective controls, effective quarantine procedures, effective saying, you know what, you probably shouldn't come here because you smell like Ebola. And we probably don't want you to come here. You know, you smell like Indian cholera. Please stay back in India.
Really? That's interesting.
But we don't do that here. And what little quarantining and what little the custom screening does is a joke. But that's what you have to do is you have to have effective screening and effective controls. So like at our hospital where they're freaking out about the flu and making everyone wear paper over their faces, they're not actually sitting there asking people, are you sick? When was the last time you had a fever? Did you get the flu shot? They're not doing that. They're just saying, please wear this mask. But you need to have active screening in order to prevent that.
And you have like the signs up that say, if you have these symptoms, please don't come into the hospital, but there's nobody enforcing it. I mean, I did because I have no manners. So if one of my patients, family members came in and was snivelly or looked poorly, I would say, you know what, you need to go home. Because if you make me sick or you make another one of these patients sick, you could kill somebody. And you don't need that on your conscience, right? So go home, get better. Your family member's being taken care of. They're fine. You don't need to be here.
Okay, you in the second row?
Yeah, just thinking of literary examples of that discusses a pandemic and what a good response would be and how that will typically break down. John Ringo's Last Centurion comes to mind. That flu epidemic. Is his description there fairly accurate as to what would probably work and how that system would probably break down and end up failing?
When it comes to John and anything related to biology, he's always on the money. It's a relief for me when I read the John Ringo book because my biologist / Dr. Brain never gets angry. But yeah, he nailed it.
You on the fourth row? Had your hand up? Okay. The other one on the second row now. Yeah, we skipped. Moved over. Yes.
So if there were some pandemic and it's basically all throughout the world, pretty much most of the world's population were to get infected with some disease, how would people deal with that if pretty much everybody had this disease?
Well, most of us just died then.
Yeah. So logistically, I think it makes it much easier because we're not worried about infection control anymore. We're just worried about morbidity management. It's actually tremendously more straightforward, I should say. But because now you have the sick doctor not worrying about coming in sick because everybody's already sick. And now you have the people not having to worry about quarantine because everybody's already sick. So it actually frees up a lot of resources that we can then use to try to take care of the more sick people by the less sick people. What you get when you get a true pandemic where there's that much infection is you get waves. So you have the first set of people that got infected, and then you have the second set, and then you have the third set. So if you're really smart, what you want to do is send about a third of your doctors in to get immediately infected, and then you wait for a couple weeks, and you send your next set in, and then you send your third set in. And that way you've always got healthcare workers who are either recovering or only a little sick. This is insane. I've never heard anyone suggest it other than me just now.
Let me tell you a historical story. What do you think happened to most of the American Indians? They died, right? So, I'm going to make this really quick. So, basically, Europe, Asia, the old world, had lots and lots of diseases because most of those diseases came from domesticated animals. The New World had next to no domesticated animals, so they didn't have these diseases. And so when Columbus and other people like him came over, unbeknownst to them, they were carrying germs that hit what's called a virgin territory. So a virgin territory, so if you go back in Europe and you look at a smallpox would come sweeping through every generation and it would hit a village and all the children would get sick. But most of the adults had immunity because they had survived smallpox as a child. Most of the time when it comes to surviving a disease, it's really basic medical care, like keep them warm, keep them fed, keep them watered, keep them loved. That's what parents would do. And you might have 20% fatality rate, but then you have more kids. What happened in the New World is a village would get hit by smallpox. They'd never experienced smallpox before. Everyone gets sick at once. There's no one well enough to take care of each other, to get water, to get food, to arrange care. And so you have massive fatality rates. I mean, you can have fatality rates 60, 80%, sometimes 90%. It's really hard for a culture to recover when you have that kind of fatality rates because you lose so much cultural knowledge. But the other thing that happens is that was smallpox. Now comes measles. Now comes whooping cough. Now comes all those childhood diseases that we use vaccines to prevent now. Those had never been seen by Native Americans, and it just worked through methodically and effectively annihilated much of the population. Now, conquistadors, other types of things, yes, those were all bad things, and those were mean people that basically treated the Native Americans like they treated peasants back in Europe. But it wasn't, what's called the American genocide is misnamed. What it was two biological worlds meeting and doing what's called the Columbian Exchange and effectively annihilating the Native Americans.
So the Native Americans did give the rest of the world syphilis, though. So
well, you had to return something. Yes.
Don't they have historical accounts of the British in putting smallpox on
Okay.
blankets and then giving them to the
Okay.
Native Americans?
This is what happened. There was a war in the 1700s, and it was called King Pontiacs War. And the British commander ordered one of his officers to infect blankets with smallpox and give them to the Indians so you could induce the smallpox epidemic. That we have that letter, and when historians said, "Wow, look at this! It was deliberate biological warfare." Well, other historians later came along and looked at it much more closely, and they found out that the officer who had been given that instruction, who was an adult, had never had smallpox as a child, and almost certainly he never obeyed that order. And from a modern medical standpoint, it's unclear whether or not you can actually transmit smallpox through blankets or not. So, yes, that was the intent of that particular officer, but that probably never really happened. Now,
really wouldn't have needed to. With how infectious smallpox is, you don't need the blanket story for smallpox to have done what it did.
Well, let's do the one. We'll do you second. Let's do her first.
Okay. Just as a note on your sending in a third of the medical and then a further third, no, that is how South African charities manage sending medical personnel to the rest of Africa for the internal refugees. They didn't put it as send a third in for them to get infected. They said that there will be a cholera epidemic coming through because there's insufficient water supplies to manage the people moving. So only send a third now, and when they get sick, we'll have reserves to send in later. It's essentially the same thing, but it was said differently. In environments like Africa, where the, shall we say, it's third world, and it spawns all sorts of interesting stuff. And when I said to my husband, at a certain point, when it started getting Ebola everywhere, he's like, "You've never had Ebola, have you?" And he's like, "Well, technically, Ebola is the name for a particular subset from one river region in." I looked at him and went, "It's just another West African hemorrhagic fever. Everybody who's been in that part of the world has one." Like, okay, so yes, that is actually for non-Americans who are used to dealing with a lot of infectious disease running around, a standard medical personnel resource management.
You said that took place in West Africa?
Yep.
Yeah.
South Africa.
Yeah. So you quit.
Africans would send their medical personnel all over Africa to help the refugee camps,
Right.
among other things, because they didn't want all the refugees flooding south to them and bringing the wars with them.
So you mentioned the Native Americans, which as a culture were basically destroyed by epidemics and diseases. How is it that some, and there are obviously more examples of other cultures being wiped out because of mass pandemics, but how is it that ones like Europe and Asia survived the Black Plague, for instance, when there was a lot of people that died during those epidemics as well?
If you have enough survivors and they reproduce and they can take care of the other people, and it's true, the Black Plague in the 13th century was, in 14th century, the first time it hit Europe. In Europe, had seen Black Plagues before, but it had been a long time. They lost about a third of their population.
Is there like a certain percentage of fatalities at which point there's just not enough people to repopulate an area in the same way?
So I think you need to start talking about population density, both in terms of infection and in terms of response and survival. So basically, if there's only like 2 or 3 people around you, then the infection can't be that crazy, otherwise it's just going to burn itself out and go nowhere. So in order for infections to get crazy enough that they start killing lots of people, you actually need high population density.
So you need cities, basically.
So you need cities. And that was actually one of the problems. It wasn't just that they weren't exposed, Native Americans weren't exposed to Europeans. Native Americans, being a more spread out culture, having relatively lower population densities, except for, you know, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas, the North American Native Americans were, you know, largely distributed. They were the equivalent of farm towns. People in those settings don't respond well to high virulence because that's not a part of what they experience, period. So you can see this village 100 miles outside of a major city in India. They're the same people genetically, but the village people have poor responses to things like flu or cholera.
And it has nothing to do with their genetic adaptability.
Yeah.
It's just based on exposure history.
Right. So then to get to your next question, so if we think about a farm town, you know, a community of 300 people, and they lose 90% of their population, what's the likelihood that they have lost a crucial skill that that town needs to survive? Very, very high. Now you take a big town, you take Salt Lake, and you take out 90% of the population. What's the likelihood that we've actually lost a skill? Very, very low. I mean, yes, the logistics of everything are incredibly awful, but I guarantee you're still going to have doctors, you're still going to have teachers, you're still going to have nurses, you're still going to have firefighters, you're still going to have police, you're still going to have everything you need.
You've been very patient.
So, if there were some type of apocalypse now, what would be a common, or what pandemics would you expect to see very shortly in our modern society here?
I'll tell you what, personally, if you want to create a terrifying pandemic, you make its incubation period like a couple of weeks. That is what's truly terrifying. Ebola, as terrifying as it was, is wonderful because it's so deadly and it burns through a population so quickly. If you can confine it, it will literally burn itself out. Now that sounds brutal. I'm sorry, but that is the reality. So what you want is something, say you're doing a bioengineered virus, and of course you want to do viruses, you don't want to do bacteria because viruses are much harder to fight than bacteria. And if it has that incubation period, especially if there's no symptoms, you can have it spread around the world very effectively. Like in that movie, the 12 Monkeys. Anyway, Anne, you would raise your hand.
I just wanted to say that the Black Death did make major cultural changes in Europe. I mean, it was great. It drove up wages.
If anything, it helped us.
It did, because there were less workers. It really drove up wages.
Silver lining, yeah.
That's right.
It produced surplus clothing.
No,
I'm
it really did.
serious.
It really
That
did.
led to the rise of the production of paper, because rag fiber was used in paper making. So this literary conference exists in part because of the Black Plague, because books became more affordable.
Thanks to Mommy Plague.
Okay. You?
So my understanding that should we have some sort of pandemic now, our major transportation hubs would be like a really big problem.
Yeah.
And
Like Salt
the
Lake.
bigger that particular hub be, the bigger the problem would be.
Yep.
More people coming into or leaving an area. just your rate for transferring that whatever infection it is just goes through the roof. So
like an international.
yeah, international airports
much
or
worse than say a local.
yeah.
In general, if you were going to design the most perfect way to spread disease, airlines is what you would have designed.
Literally, yeah. I'm trying to think of an area where they don't excel, and
you.
Okay. I feel like I don't know a whole lot about this, so I depend a lot on fiction to make my ideas make sense. But I kind of want to throw out, I looked at the idea of vertical transfer viruses, that even if you did go into remission, that you're still passing viruses from generation. I don't really know what my question is. I just...
No, that's an interesting and horrible idea.
Yeah.
It's got a ton of science fiction potential because there's actually a lot of science potential in it. So one of the things people are looking at is these viruses that do incorporate themselves into our DNA permanently. We know that they're at least 10% of our jump DNA, and we know that so much of that jump DNA isn't really jump DNA. So
Typhoid Mary, wasn't she one of those?
She had typhoid, but she didn't have any symptoms.
Yeah,
and that's why she was able to spread it to so many
But I think what you're talking about is viruses that stay
from generation to generation.
because they get incorporated into our DNA.
So they go into the germ cells.
Yeah, and so that is the thing. But typically, what happens is that they just become a part of our DNA. They change us. We don't know what they're doing to us, but they are now just us.
Yeah.
So is it realistic to depend on fiction, since we know so little about it right now? It's not really a thing to have a vertical transfer virus that acts that way. I mean, because it's basically making cancer a virus.
Right.
Basically.
Right.
Is it realistic to depend on fiction for all the unanswered questions?
I think I would qualify that as hard biological SF if you gave a very decent description of vertical transmission viruses. We know they happen in cats, feline, and
what is
FIP.
Yeah.
That's one where.
What's it called?
FIP. If you Google it, you'll find it. It's horrifying. Right?
It is because it's a virus that actually causes behavioral changes in people, and you can see it statistically. But let's move to the guy with the glasses.
So you talked about like a modern pandemic. What would be a realistic response time for a viral pandemic by like they come out with an antiviral or vaccine for it?
That's it depends. I mean, that's
desperate.
Yeah.
Not as fast as the movie Outbreak.
Right. So your minimum time to produce, assuming that you've got stars in the lab, they isolate the infectious thing that they need to make the vaccine to, and they're just, studs of the virology. Well, 6 weeks minimum to get anything prototyped. So then to go range up into mass production, you're going to need at least 3 months. So you're looking at 4 to 5 months before there's an effective, and that's with everything just clicking. Which is unlikely because one of the things that makes pandemics is that our immune system has trouble with them, which also means that we're going to have trouble with them as scientists because the immune system is actually remarkably sophisticated.
Yes, you.
So would there be any difference in response between something, between a person responding to a naturally occurring thing or something that was weaponized?
So I am in the Air National Guard in Utah, and I'm in our radiological, biological, etc. response unit. I'm a critical care nurse there. So if there was some sort of biological something that happened, like a biological terrorist attack, my unit is the one that would respond to that. And so the training that we get is same across the board. So whether it was naturally occurring or, obviously if there was still like hostile players in it, but our role is the same. We standardize everything, and it just go to the the big like ET suits basically, and that's how we go for everything. Especially if we don't know what it is, you just put all your gear on and hope that you're protected.
As a civilian physician, I can say that our civilian response is to add on a couple of extra totems. We put on this little yellow dress and
totems.
You can get the pepper.
You in the very back row.
I just had a comment about diseases that make it into our DNA. I read an article that presented evidence that schizophrenia and multiple sclerosis are both such diseases that are in our DNA, and we have certain mechanisms occasionally those mechanisms get broken. Disease gets systemic stress.
And I think that's a plausible way. So the idea is that possibly schizophrenia and multiple sclerosis are caused by viruses that alter our DNA. I think that's a very plausible idea, and I think that's something that you could run with in a story quite readily.
So it wouldn't then be a mental disorder anymore, would it? Then
No,
be
it
a
is.
viral
It
infection?
manifests itself as a mental disorder.
Still a mental disorder. That's
Yeah,
still got to be treated by me with my medicine.
Regardless, regardless of the etiology of the source, it goes to the people that are used to working with those symptoms.
I will say this though, Haldol, our classic schizophrenia medicine, actually has fairly potent anti-parasite activity, which is interesting if you look at Toxoplasma, which has schizophreniform features and stuff.
Yourself, yes. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. There's a lot of people.
Another game. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with a game called Ink.
I love that game. It's fun. You get to play the virus or the bacteria, and you get to wipe out all the people in the world.
How good of a jumping off point? Like, obviously, we cannot, you can't just be like, oh, I'm going to write a story about this. I'm going to go play Plague for 100 hours.
Yeah.
But how good of a jumping off point is it?
It's a good jumping off point because if you get good in that game at killing all the humans, you start to kind of develop this like, okay, this is a really good vector for getting the disease out there. That game, so spoiler alert, if you make your disease asymptomatic until you've affected everybody and then start making people bleed out of their eyeballs, you kill everyone really fast. So if I've played it a lot, it's really fun, guys. And it's free! You can do it for free.
On YouTube has about 12 videos in it, and it's amazing.
It's a hoot, and you can be a bacteria, you can be a virus, you can be a parasite, you can be anything that you can think. You can be a nanobot. You can be all kinds of different stuff, and different things require different. If you're a parasite, your mode of infecting is different than if you're a bacteria, which is different than if you're a virus. And different things work, like depending on how hard the settings are, you'll either have doctors who never wash their hands, or doctors who wash their hands, they walk around and they just wash their hands all the time. So you can, if you want to kind of get your head around what it would be like to be a virus trying to kill everybody, that it's fun, and it can definitely make you think of things that you wouldn't have otherwise, I think.
So I actually want to touch on that because that's really funny. So again, I make fun of the busybodies infection control a lot, but about 5 to 10 years ago, we hit this point where we were washing our hands too much. And because they were like, no, you need to wash your hands then and then and then, and you touch the computer, you got to wash your hands again. So we all got skin breakdown. And then we started transmitting more. Yeah.
I was about to say, it's like by washing hands too much doesn't cause problems.
Yeah, and then there's me. I'm the doctor that treats OCD, and I'm like, is this OCD or are they just trying to control infection? But I kid you not, I actually have to do exposure response prevention protocols with some of my nurses who get so panicky about infection control. And they're like, no, I need it. It's like, okay, it's going to work on it. And I do the same treatment we do for OCD.
You walk out of a room and you're like, I have to put the stuff on where is it? The bottle's not here. Oh no! And then you can't do anything.
So we have about 5 more minutes, and so we're wrapping up. So there's 4 questions. Let's just go with those. Yes, purple.
Yeah, with current medical technology progressions and what they see is what they're guessing is going to happen, what they're working on and stuff. How do you see that applying to futuristic pandemics and responses and such?
I think the tried and true stuff is still what we're going to be doing, unless we get some really weird stuff like a digital virus that can have biological effects. And you can come up with scenarios where you have that. No? You don't want to do that?
Scary.
Yes.
Antivirals.
Okay. You in the very back. Yes.
So the evolution of the disease or life form was increased production because of heat. How would that work?
The movie Evolution?
Yeah.
That movie was actually written as a serious hard sci-fi script, and then they turned it into a comedy. A lot of the science in it is not completely implausible, even though it's just a fun movie. That's my take on that movie, for those that want to know. You had your hand raised.
Oh,
yeah, number 3.
I was wondering, is there any history, just because I don't know much about diseases, is there any history of any of these illnesses or pandemics affecting the earth or plants or the world around them? Is that possible? Most diseases die once the person's buried, but is that ever...
So, I mean, part of what makes influenza so, and the one where we panic it, is because it moves between species and between classes of animals. I mean, it moves everywhere. Between plants and humans, there's not a lot of infections I'm aware of, if any, actually. But between humans and other vertebrates, all the time. That's definitely a thing. So you can absolutely have all the birds fall from the sky because of a human flu, or you can have all the humans start dying because of a bird flu. But typically, these viruses, once you bury a body, they're no longer going to be able to be transmitted because they're transmitted through either body fluids or the air.
What's the one besides horse and hoof and mouth that we follow the cows all the way back to the border to make sure we burn all the traces they left behind, because it goes back and forth between cattle.
Anthrax.
But Nick, what about,
Plus, prion-based diseases can be very interesting. Go ahead. Sorry.
I said fungal infections. That would be the one that go back between plant world and humans.
So that's actually a good point. Fungus will live in the soil. It'll infect plants, humans, animals. But there's not really any virulent fungal infections that I'm aware of that people get if they're not already dying of something else.
But if I'm making up my infection, right?
Then you could go with the virulent fungus. Absolutely.
Yes, but let's try to make it plausible. So, you in the striped shirt? Young man. Young man.
So, let's say if the most overused generic plot device of a zombie apocalypse ever happened, how would, based on what we do now with pandemics, how would we likely deal with it? Like the world's governments?
Well, first of all, they would be slow zombies, not this crappy fast.
Just read World War Z.
Well, there would be a lot more skin checks, I'll tell you that. Because I love the whole person, I got bit, I'm going to pretend that I'm fine. No, every time you come back in, there's going to be a strip search skin check. We're going to make sure that you have not been bit. If we do that, we're fine. That's literally the only reason anybody ever fails in a zombie apocalypse. Some jerk, some selfish jerk decides that they won't die.
They're in denial.
World War Z, the way the Israelis handled it, would be the way to go.
That's a very interesting book. It's a fun movie, but it's a much more interesting book. So we're gonna. You can come up and talk to us afterwards, but the panels used to always go to 50 minutes after an hour. Now they're trying to go to 45 minutes after the hour because we're split between two buildings. So I just want to end with some advice from each of us, and when we start with you.
Wash your hands. That is the number one way to prevent the spread of infections, washing your hands. So please, wash your hands.
Oh, with soap.
With soap, yes. You sing happy birthday to yourself twice, and then you're done.
Okay.
But not too much, because then you get sick.
Not all the time.
There's too many rules.
Yeah, so my advice would be if someone is sick, don't rub all over them. Other people's bodily fluids should stay on them and not you. This is kind of my advice to you.
If it's wet and it's not yours, don't.
But if you're a pediatric specialist, you don't get that luxury. You end up with children. Yeah.
So the last thing I would say, most of what you're going to learn from watching movies, and watch good movies. There was a TV series, I think it was, I can't remember what it was called. It was a Netflix TV series, and it's about an outbreak in Atlanta. It's really interesting for the first episode and a half, and then it becomes so terminally stupid that it was a pain. What they did is
relationship actually.
What they did is it was all about dramatic impact rather than you're going like, that doesn't make any sense as an isolation protocol. That doesn't make any sense about how a person would behave. That doesn't make any sense about how medicine works or epidemics
So you're
work.
saying watching pandemic movies with you is like watching war movies with soldiers, flying movies with pilots, and NCS with a forensic investigator.
You make that sound like a bad thing. Thank you for coming to our panel.